You hooked up? Just have it up. Yes. We all hooked up? I am, yes. Good evening. Welcome to the forum. My name is Michael Gartner. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Politics. Please let me introduce the panelists for this evening. On my far right, but more important, your far left, let me start with Bob Shrum, because of his many ties to Harvard. He's a graduate of the law school and was a fellow here at the Institute of Politics. He was press secretary to Senator Edward Kennedy, and then his speechwriter. And now he's as a political consultant, he's an advisor to scores of politicians, including the senator who clearly took his advice last night. He was the nation's top debater when he was an undergraduate at Georgetown, and he won an advocacy prize at Harvard Law. So he's well suited by education and by temperament for his role as writer, advocate, and consultant. Welcome, Bob. Shelley Cohen is listed on the masthead of the Boston Herald as Rochelle Cohen. She is the editorial page editor of that newspaper and a political columnist for it. She's a graduate of Temple University, and she's a seasoned government and political reporter, including a 6-year stint with the Associated Press. Welcome, Shelley. Frank Luntz, on my far left, is a researcher and consultant and teacher, and, I should quickly point out, another former fellow at the Institute of Politics. He runs the Luntz Research Companies in Washington, and he has advised such diverse candidates as Ross Perot and Rudy Giuliani. He's an adjunct professor at his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, from which he has a bachelor's degree, and he has a doctorate in politics from Oxford. Welcome. My old friend Al Hunt, sitting next to me, is executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal, where he has worked for nearly 30 years. He has been reporting from Washington since 1969, and for 10 years, until last year, he was the Washington bureau chief of the Journal. He writes a column of opinion, usually strong opinion, each week on the Journal's op-ed page, and he has been one of CNN's Capital Gang since the program started in 1988. He is a regular political panelist on the Today Show on NBC, and he's one of the 2 or 3 most knowledgeable political reporters in the country today. Welcome, Al. Each panelist will talk for 4 or 5 minutes, then we'll get into questions and discussions, presumably about more than just the debate last evening. We will be no rowdier than Senator Kennedy and Mr. Romney were last night, but we might be a bit more illuminating. I believe we agreed to start with you, Bob.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I think that we could be any more illuminating than that debate was. I love being back here. I was a fellow, I should confess to the students here, at such a point in my life and in the calendar that many of you could be the children of people who were on the Student Advisory Committee and who were friends of mine when I was a fellow here. Frank and I have debated on a number of occasions which of us was the youngest fellow of the Institute of Politics at the time, and I'm not going to ever concede that, but I found it one of the most refreshing and interesting experiences of my life. I think this is a special place. I think from what I know of President Kennedy and the Kennedy family, that this place in very, very many ways testifies to things that he really cared about including the engagement of young people in public affairs, and, very importantly, the contact of people who are active in politics and public affairs with young people, who are a source of unorthodoxy, refreshment, and challenge. I'll say a few words about what I think is the general lay of this land in 1994. It is not a happy terrain for Democrats as a general proposition, but I think it's not a happy terrain for the system. And I think that there is an underlying economic reality combined with certain media realities that are having long-term effects on American politics. Basically, since 1973 in this country, real income for workers has declined. That's masked by the number of improvements we've had, the number of jobs that have been created, the semi-boom of the Reagan years, although I think it contained the seeds of its own destruction. But basically, people's real wages have not gone up. And in fact, from 1989 to 1993, real hourly income went down. I think the number is from $7.80 an hour to an average of $7.30 an hour. I think there's enormous frustration out there. I think in 1992, the Democrats were the beneficiaries of it. I think that Bill Clinton did a very good job of saying, if you're happy with the way things are, not only in terms of unemployment, but if you're happy with the way things are in terms of your own standard of living, if you feel good about the future, then you should vote for George Bush. If you want change and you think you could do better, then you should vote for us. Well, turnabout, I suppose, is fair play, and to some extent that's what's happened in 1994, because whatever efforts you make to turn the country around and to turn the economy around are going to take a longer time, at least when dealing with underlying economic problems like our competitiveness in the world, the skills of our workforce, the wages that people make, their security about their future and their standard of living. It's also a hard case to sell in a lot of ways. I mean, a new system of job education, for example, doesn't make a great bumper sticker. I mean, Clinton may find a way to dramatize it next year in the State of the Union message. What does make a great bumper sticker are things like term limits. Congressmen are paid too much while your real wages are down, although people don't say it that way. People don't think the way we think, real wage. I mean, they just know what's going on in their lives. And I think the Republicans have done a wonderful job this year of basically telling people, untruthfully in my view, that the problem is the government. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was very illustrative last night when the first thing Romney said about how he would cut the federal deficit and make up $700 billion was to change the system of pensions for senators and congressmen. It is, in fact, a drop in the bucket. In fact, it's hardly spit in the bucket. But I think it has been a wonderful political message, wonderfully crafted to offer people psychic satisfaction in a time when they're very frustrated. And I think that is the underlying reality of what's going on out there. I think there are economic causes to this feeling that people have. I think they are fed by the fact that only 50% of people in this country now read newspapers, according to one recent survey. People are getting more and more of their news from television. And television news is shrinking in terms of the amount of time it gives anything or in terms of the amount of coverage it gives to serious subjects. One of the things I thought was fabulous when I looked it up the other day, in the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon opening debate, each candidate spoke for 8 minutes for an opening statement. Each candidate had 3 minutes to answer each question, and then 2 minutes to comment on the opponent's answer. Now we have soundbited the debates, so the debates don't have opening statements because people think that's boring, and they have 1-minute answers followed by 30-second commentaries. And I think that the attention span and almost the way we get our information in media is reinforcing this, because the more interesting story and the easier story to tell in a soundbite is these cruddy people are being overpaid. I bet if you went out and did a survey, you would find that, and said to people, is Congress more corrupt today than it was 30 years ago? People would say yes. It's wrong. It's not true. And anybody who has been around Washington knows that in many different ways it's not true. Now, there are institutional problems, the power of PACs and all of that, but people are not receiving money, cash money in envelopes and throwing it in desk drawers. At least now people have some idea where the money is coming from. There was a wonderful letter from Daniel Webster that I saw recently where he wrote a letter to somebody at the Bank of New England or something saying, if you don't send your remittance soon, I can't introduce your legislation. I mean, we have a higher standard now than we did then. But the story is much more interesting to focus in on a scandal, the ABC News perk of the week, or whatever they call that thing. So I think that tends to reinforce this. And finally, and you will all turn to me and say, yeah, and doesn't negative media do that too? And you're seeing an awful lot of negative media this year, or what people call negative media. Frank's candidates have negative media. My candidates have corrective media. I mean, what's really happened is that people in this mood and this atmosphere are much more willing to believe ungood things about people than they are willing to believe good things about people. I think that's one reason that there's a fair amount of what people call negative media, or media that mentions your opponent. The other reason, I think, is because in a lot of states, in a lot of places, the Republicans ran, the Democrats do sometimes, but the Republicans ran this year a lot of individuals who might be described in the phrase of my partner Tad Devine as the man who fell to earth. They wanted someone to arrive, have no record, take positions entirely crafted by a poll, and say, now you can elect me because I agree with you on everything. And what's happened is that has elicited people looking, say, for example, into Michael Huffington's business background. Did he really have a business background? What does that mean? And it's deepened the levels of examination, so that it turns out that the men who fell to earth carried some baggage with them, and people have looked at the baggage. I think all of that said, I do not think that this will be a particularly good year for Democrats, but I think that it will not be as good a year for Republicans as Newt Gingrich thought it was when he lit the bonfire and started dancing around it about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think there's been some stabilization in the Democratic numbers and some uptick, but I would conclude by cautioning you, as I caution myself every morning when I get up, that the situation is very volatile almost everywhere in America. Thank you.
Shelley.
I ought to preface my remarks here tonight by saying I live and work in Massachusetts. I have for some time, and therefore consider myself in an odd way politically challenged. I think, as you know, so many of you are finding out who are spending time here, Massachusetts is, in many ways, a world unto itself. We're not necessarily connected to the rest of the nation, and so it's sometimes difficult to extrapolate what we're seeing and experiencing here to the rest of the country. Having said that, however, let's look at Massachusetts. We have, for example, on the ballot, not only a few very exciting races, some of which we're going to talk about here tonight, but we've got 9 ballot questions, ranging from the more or less substantive, like a grad tax, to the utterly absurd, like how to use highway funds. Do you really care? Not a lot of people do. They don't belong on the ballot. There is a term limitation amendment, among other things. But what they say about the process is that people have lost faith in the process. They've lost an awful lot of faith in their public officials, and for every issue that makes it onto the ballot, you can probably count 10 or 20 or 100,000 people who have lost faith in what government ought to be doing. That's Massachusetts. We're not alone in this. Hot stuff in California. I think Oregon has double the number of ballot issues. That doesn't bode well for the process. In 1990, in Massachusetts, there was a ferocious anger out there. An anger that voters took out on any number of incumbents. They were literally pulling the other guy lever. Half of these people never even expected to be elected to office. Didn't last long, actually. Many of them were out by 92. But some of that anger, at least here, has dissipated. I agree with Bob that there was that kind of anti-incumbent fervor abound in the land to a certain extent over the past year. I do think much of it is dissipating even as we speak. I think it won't be as awful a year for Democrats as we earlier anticipated. I think also to a certain extent, Republicans are obviously going to pick up some seats. Conventional wisdom is they always do in off-year elections when the guy in the White House is a Democrat. But I don't think they'll win control of either house. They may win, de facto control. And as a Republican told me very off the record, that's just the way they'd like it. It would be wonderful. The Republicans just shy of a majority. All of the fun, none of the responsibility. They can still blame it on the guy in the White House. Couldn't be better. So that's my take on national politics from a Massachusetts seat. But I can't resist picking up on some of what Bob said vis-a-vis the media's role in all of this. And some of those are points well taken. The debate structure really hit home because I was in on those negotiations. And they are brutal, and they are very different because they are structured for television, and I'd be the first one to admit that. If the two we had a remarkable development on the face of it. The two major newspapers in this town actually agreed on something. We were going to co-sponsor something, a totally unprecedented event. But having done that, then at a certain point, we quite literally had to take a back seat to our brethren in the TV business. Their judgment that, indeed, 1-minute openings, nobody listens, it's dull, eliminate them. We were down to, I think we agreed finally on maybe 90-second closings. 60 seconds, you get 90 tomorrow night.
Right, and the
don't
30
spend it
second,
all
and
in
the
one
30
place.
second responses at one point were cut to 15 seconds.
Well, yes, on the redirect and rebuttal. But these are the way these things are negotiated. You also, when you deal with television, have to negotiate the size of the podium and other such trivia. If newspapers were doing, if we were doing it all by our onesies, would it be the case? No, of course it wouldn't. But that's the wonderful world of TV. Now, to our credit, it's not the only thing we do. And we did have the senator in for, as it turned out, a 2-hour-long editorial board meeting. First hour with all of our editors and reporters. Second hour with the latest development on the journalism scene, the citizen panel. I think it's probably started for some kind of cynical, perhaps all the wrong reasons. It was trendy. Everyone wants to involve people. However, having involved them, they're wonderful. It has been one of the better developments in this election season. We've done it, the Globe's done it. I'm sure it's caught on all across the country. Real people having a say in the news product. And the real good news is they hold our feet to the fire to a certain extent. While our reporters may go off on a campaign fundraising tangent, who's doing what to whom, your ads were awful. No, your ads were awful. It's the citizen panel that you will see a lot more of in tomorrow night's debate that says, sorry guys, I want to hear about issues, I want to hear about jobs, I want to hear about welfare. And we're, agreeing to the extent that it all needs to be done, and we can do it all. TV, sad to say, can't do it all. They get 30 minutes, maybe 60 if they're lucky, and they've got a lot more territory to cover. That's their problem. I'm happy to say it's not mine. Thanks.
Al.
Thank you, Michael. I have never been a fellow here because I've never been invited to be a fellow here. But I've been coming here for 20 years. I think this is a special place. I've had a very active involvement with the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center and a longer one with the Institute of Politics. I associate myself with everything that Bob Shrum said earlier about what a very, very special and stimulating place this is. And I've always enjoyed coming back, and today is certainly no exception. I'm also pleased to be on the right side of the panel as you face us with my old friend Frank Luntz. I knew Frank before he worked for Newt Gingrich. So like saying I knew Frank before he was a virgin. It's good to see you again, though, Frank. Shelley, I'll tell you, I'm going to start off by saying that I think the Republicans are going to be very disappointed because I think you laid out that scenario of what they want, and they're not going to achieve it. I think they are going to get control. I think they're going to win control of the Senate. I think there is a 50% chance they're going to win control of the House, and we will have Speaker Gingrich. And then you can ask Frank why he did that to you. I think they are going to win at least 7 and possibly as many as 9 of the 9 governorships in the 9 most populous states. I think it's going to be a big, big day for the Republican Party on November 8th, certainly the biggest since 1980, the biggest in an off-year election for them since 1966. So why? First of all, there is, as both Shelley and Bob mentioned a moment ago, this is what happens in midterm elections. Midterm elections, the party that doesn't control the White House invariably does well. There's a myth that only happens in the second cycle of a presidential term. It's not true. It happens the first term too, and there's just a natural reason for that. Certainly it's happened since 1960 that way. I think a second reason is something that Bob talked about earlier. There is greater cynicism in the land, and I think the Republicans have very effectively capitalized on that this year. Robert, you're right. When you talk about the people's feelings about Congress being so corrupt, I first started to cover Congress over 20 years ago. And I want to tell you, back then, I covered the House Banking Committee, and it was a farm club for Allenwood Penitentiary. 7 of the members ended up in the slammer in the next year. This Congress today is so much more honest than its predecessors, but that's not the view for most people. They're very disgusted with politics. They're very disgusted with politicians. And you look at the campaigns this year, and something really, I think, remarkable, not that it didn't exist before, but never to this degree. You look at almost any campaign, and what happens is the front runner, usually the incumbent, starts off with a favorable rating of maybe 55%, 57%, 53%. Then the campaign gets going. They start going back and forth. Goes down to 41%, 40%, 38%, while the other person not as well known will have about a 35% favorable, about a 20% unfavorable, and then the other ads start. California is the prototype of this. You're going to elect more people this year who are going to have favorable ratings of under 40% than we have ever seen before. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable. People are going to be holding their nose and voting for the least of the bums, and so that's why I don't think it's a very edifying election. And I think that if there's a third reason, however, I think that you have to lay some of the blame on the Democrats or on Clinton in particular. In the sense that in 1992, he overpromised. He built up expectations too much. He suggested it was going to be easy. And he didn't quite level with people. And you have to pay a price for that. I think what I find in traveling is I will be very surprised on November the 8th if there is this huge surge in turnout. My guess is turnout will be lower than it was 4 years ago. And that's because the Republicans are going to vote. They're sort of angry. They're the antis. And the real key to this election is the dispirited Democrats are going to stay home. And that's because they don't feel very good, and they don't feel very proud about the way things are going. And they don't give Clinton credit for the economy. In part, I think, Bob, it's because of what you pointed out, that people's real incomes still are not going up. But in part, it's because they voted in 1992. They were told, if you end this divided government, things are going to be a lot better. Their perception is that things are not a lot better. Now, having said that, what I think it comes down to, however, is that this is a negative mandate. It is not a positive mandate. Frank put together with Newt the so-called Contract for or Contract on America, depending on your perspective. It is a neat piece of political work. They went out, and Frank is as good a pollster and focus group person as there is in America, and they found out everything that was popular, everything that got over 60%, and they put it together. So like me telling my 13-year-old, yep, I'm going to give you that computer you want. You want it? Jeffrey, you got it. Now, Benjamin, you want to have all those Sega games? Yep, you're going to get every single one of them. And my daughter, yep, you're going to get that dollhouse. And everyone's going to be real happy. Now, I'm going to be broke, but they're all going to be happy.
Not with your salary.
Yeah, well, my wife doesn't give me the money for those presents. But basically what they've done is they have a document that doesn't add up. Now, it ain't going to make any difference on November the 8th. It's helped a few Democrats join the national dialogue, but it basically ain't going to matter. But the point I'm getting to is it is going to matter after this election, because on November the 9th, people are going to wake up and say, Clinton's a one-term president, the Republicans are in the ascendancy. Once again, we've gone back to to what has been normalcy, Republican domination in national politics, and it's not going to be true. Because after that, whether they have an actual control or working control, the debate shifts. And the Republicans then, when we come to the national election cycle, They're going to have to say what they're for, and they won't sell the snake oil stuff. It just simply won't sell with people because they know it's not true. And when that happens, if I had to predict right now, I would predict everything I said a moment ago. Republicans are going to win control of both houses, control all the governorships, and Bill Clinton will be reelected in 1996. And I was, to paraphrase my old friend Mark Shields, the first national political correspondent to predict that President Muskie would not run for a second term. So given that track record, I'll now yield to my friend Frank.
Thank you. Frank?
Al Hunt actually was responsible for my getting a job at the Wall Street Journal, and he was one of the first reporters that was kind to me. And I would suggest it has been very often kind of a father-son relationship, which is as good a case as any, as I know for being an orphan in the future. and as far as Bob Shrum attacking Republicans for their negative attacks against his candidates, Bob, when your candidates stop lying about my candidates will stop telling the truth about yours. So
That's Harry Truman's old line, which ends, and I tell the truth on them, and they call it hell.
yeah, we could use Truman. Democrats could use Truman right now. There's something called the Saliva Index, and right now it's at an all-time high, and that has to do with focus groups. A focus group is where you gather 10 or 12 people in a room, and you talk to them about government, you talk to them about Washington. And the Saliva Index is how much they cover you as the moderator with saliva when they spit as they complain about why they hate Washington, why they hate Congress. The problem is the chief executive is a president, and because it begins with P, it lends itself to greater saliva. And right now we're at an all-time high. Americans overall, maybe not in Massachusetts, but Americans overall have never been so hostile and so frustrated with the government in Washington. And whether it's deserved or not is not my job, because I'm only the person who reports the information. But they are so angry because they don't think that Washington listens. It's not the government per se, it's the city. It's the city who's about to re-elect a mayor that got busted on national television for doing coke and then claiming that he wasn't guilty. I mean, you saw the video, and they're about to put him back into office. Now, maybe in Boston, maybe here at the Kennedy School, and I was a fellow, and it is wonderful to be back here, and I'm sure I won't be back for another 2 years after this. But in Boston, maybe that's a cool thing, or maybe it's acceptable. But the fact is, for people in Kansas and Iowa and Nebraska, putting Marion Barry back into office is weird. It's crazy. They look at Dan Rostenkowski, and they saw through all these hard copy shows, and then they read in the newspaper about these scandals. Same thing with Bob Packwood on the Republican side. They don't understand why these people can stay in office. It is true that we probably have a less corrupt legislature than we had in the past, but that's not the perception. And the problem now is something deeper than government. It's deeper than the partisanship or the games that we all may play with each other trying to get a laugh out of you all. It goes to the core of what we are as a nation. I am still part of the younger generation, I hope. I identify more with the students than I do with the faculty, even though I teach with the faculty. And I would ask you all by a show of hands, how many of you believe that the American dream is still very much alive? Raise your hand. As I've said, Harvard doesn't represent anything. We released figures on this on Friday, and it was covered in most legitimate newspapers. I didn't see it in the Wall Street Journal.
We're not legitimate.
I didn't think so. Only 23% of Americans think the American dream is very much alive. Only 22% of Americans think that they've already achieved it. And 3 out of 4 Americans believe it's going to be tougher to achieve for the next generation. Do y'all think you're going to have it as good as your parents did? Most young people don't. The so-called Generation Xers think they've been screwed by the boomers and by the pre-retirees and the retirees. And if you are offended by the word screwed, I'm using a nice word there because that's not what they say to me in the focus groups. The anger out there is an intergenerational anger, and it has something to do with the economy, and it has something to do with government, but it's greater than that. It's a fear of the future. The idea that your quality of life will not be as good as your parents. And your parents, by the way, if they haven't told you this, because they want to be nice to you and they don't want to give you nightmares, they don't think your quality of life is going to be as good as theirs. And we've never been that way as a nation. You know, no matter how far back you go, even in the Great Depression, people thought the next generation would have it better. This intergenerational pessimism is weighting down our national psyche. And it's making us mad and frustrated because we don't know what to do about it. We listen to Republicans and Democrats like Bob and myself go back and forth with each other, and we see crime getting worse. I taught a student 2 weeks ago. I came in and guest lectured at a class at George Washington University, and this woman was involved in the discussion. 6 days later, in a very safe neighborhood in Crystal City, in a suburb of Washington, she was carjacked and killed. And so everyone in that apartment complex from now on is going to be afraid, and everyone in that community is going to be afraid. Even if the statistics on crime are coming down, the fear is greater. And what about you all? You're safe. You're at Harvard. You're all going to get jobs. But what happens if you came out? Well, maybe not a few of you. But what about if you graduated from a state school? And what about if you don't have a college education? People are afraid that they cannot achieve what their dreams and aspirations are. And that's why they're angry. This is not a Republican vote. I got into deep trouble because one of my memos on it got leaked. It's not a pro-Republican vote, even though Republicans are going to do as well as Al Hunt said they are. And it's not even an anti-democratic vote, although it's becoming one because it's the Democratic incumbents that are losing, not Republicans. But it truly is an anti-Washington vote because Americans as one, young and old, are rising up, and they are saying, just as they did in that movie, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And that's why you're going to see an awful lot of incumbents defeated, many more than usual, and you will see the Republicans take the Senate and probably take the House. And then the challenge comes to keep that contract. I don't think it was an empty promise. Al Hunt has written article after article in the Journal about the contract. Now, I don't want to nail him too hard because when this is done, I'm going to ask him for another job, so he may not give it to me. But he misses the point. And what I should have done is I should have taken him out to some of the focus groups we did so you could see what people are looking for. Just once, they're looking for someone to keep their promise. And it is my hope that we get the majority. I will be the first one who leaves the Republican Party if we don't keep our promises on the contract. But imagine how different it would be to keep those 10 promises. Imagine how people would look and say, just for the first time, finally a politician has done what they said they were going to do. I think that would be the first step on the road back to optimism, on the road to a better country. Thank you.
Thank you. Al, very quickly, what's 7 seats?
Well, I think the only thing I just get frank on, I don't think a lot of incumbents are going to lose on November 8th. I think almost 90% of Democratic incumbents will be reelected.
Tom Foley?
I didn't say which ones. The ones that in the Senate, Wofford may surprise you. The ones in the Senate
I'll bet you dinner on it.
that will the first shift will take place in 6 open seats that are held by the Democrats, all of which will go to the Republicans. Arizona, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Ohio, Michigan, and Maine. They're all going to shift. They're all going to switch Republican. Then there are 3 or 4 seats that are now held by Democratic incumbents: Pennsylvania, Virginia, conceivably New Jersey, and a couple others that they'll be lucky to hold. I mean, I must say I agree with Frank's characterization of Washington re-electing Marion Barry. But Frank, lest you, as in your newfound role as Republican, grab the high ground, let's not forget that right next door, you're about to elect a felon, Oliver North. I really don't. I am no more outraged by the election of Marion Barry than the election of Oliver North. Are you?
North's a nice guy.
So, and I think in the House, the key in the House is, again, there are 31 Democratic-held open seats, of which I think at least half of them are going to switch to the Republicans. And so I think it's going to be the open seat, and the key is going to be turnout. There will be some incumbents who will lose, but I don't think there are going to be a whole lot of incumbents who are going to lose. You're not going to have record incumbents going down November the 8th.
Is there a single Republican senator that you think will be defeated?
Yeah, I think Conrad Burns, with his racial sensitivity courses of the last couple of days, may prove. People say there are only 2,800 blacks in the whole state of Montana. That's not the point. People in Montana are good people. They're embarrassed by having a buffoon.
They're embarrassed.
I mean, the man is a total buffoon, as you would agree, right, Frank?
Well,
Hey,
what Conrad Burns said, now I'm going to upset another person on the panel. What Conrad Burns said in Montana is not that much worse than what a certain senator and a relative of a senator said in Massachusetts about religion. And
Oh,
so
I think
before you
that's-
all laugh,
I think that's
before you all
outrageous. I think
applaud-
the use of the word nigger is a totally unacceptable thing in this society.
And I think it's unacceptable.
Completely and totally.
And I
Frank,
think
don't
it's-
do
no.
Massachusetts campaigning here. We'll do it. I'll be happy to do
I'm
it.
sure, and
Can we
this is
stop
your
for a minute?
school.
Wait a minute, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Let's explain for those of you who don't read the political hotline exactly what Burns said. Burns didn't use the word nigger.
Yeah,
First
he
of all.
quoted
No,
someone
no,
who's
no. A man who came up to him used it.
And then he quoted the person
So,
and said,
well, let's tell the story here so that people know what you're talking about. And why don't you talk about who Conrad Burns is, first of all?
he's a senator from Montana.
Democratic senator from
Yeah.
Montana.
No,
Republican
Excuse me,
senator.
Republican
First
senator
term
from Montana. Yeah, right, excuse me. Broadcaster, as I recall.
Yes, and maybe that's how he got into trouble, because he was quoting somebody. And he was talking with an editor, as I recall, at the local newspaper, and he said, somebody asked me the other day how I could
Farmer
stand,
came up to me.
yeah, and asked me how I could stand living in Washington, D.C. with all of those, and he used the word. And he's later said, well, I guess I shouldn't have used the word in repeating the story. I think that's a totally unacceptable thing in American society.
And do you think that-
Completely.
Well, he also went on to say, geez, I don't know, how do you?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just that the guy told the story, Burns agreed with it.
But it's still offensive when you bring up religion, particularly, and I know I'm in the hotbed of hostility to this, but I'm Jewish, and I don't like the idea of someone raising someone's religion and holding them responsible for what others have said or other parts of tenets. Particularly if you knew your history, you knew what John Kennedy went through in 1960 about being a Catholic. And I suggest you go back, because I saw you shake your head no. I suggest you go back and you read the books about what Kennedy went through, because it was horrible. The greatest thing that we had was when we can break down the barriers by color, by religion, by gender, and it doesn't help when you try to raise religion as an issue.
And you know what the worst part was? The worst part was it was beginning to work. The numbers were beginning to show. You raise the suspicion, Mormon? Huh? Kind of strange. There aren't a lot of Mormons around here. And the numbers, Romney's numbers started to drop. Gee, I'm not sure what he stands for. And then you tie it to the abortion issue and you tie it to the gay issue, which the Boston Globe attempted as best they could to do at that particular point. And it all begins to work. And then after it works, of course, you say, oh, no, this was inappropriate, it doesn't, and we're not going to do it anymore.
I would only say two things. First is that what Senator Kennedy said last night is something I completely agree with. It shouldn't be an issue, and the way not to make it an issue is not to talk about it, and I don't intend to talk about it, except to reject what I regard as a completely odious comparison on the part of my sometime friend Frank Luntz, who should know whatever else he knows and whatever else people think of Edward M. Kennedy. He has spent his life taking down barriers of discrimination. I feel very strongly about that, and I'm sorry. I'm going to say it, and I'm going to repeat it, and I'm going to say it again if I have to say it. I secondly find it, to switch to a less intense track, I find it wonderful to hear Republicans paying such great and eloquent tribute to taking down the barriers of discrimination. Most of the laws that did that, they opposed when those laws were first passed.
Bob, in your opening remarks, you talked about the decline of real wages in America for the last probably 20 years. And then Frank said, or Al said, that Democrats are going to, the disaffected Democrats are going to sit home. Isn't this a natural for labor? Where is labor in the Democratic Party? Why aren't they out working and getting out the vote and doing what they traditionally did?
Well, I think labor is working, and I think there'll be a lot of effort made by unions all across the country, and frankly, I think without it, the Democrats would have a great deal of trouble, would have a great deal more trouble. The fundamental reality of the year, I think both Al and Shelley referred to, and I agree with, is that in off years, the party in power loses some seats. With the exceptions of 1934 and 1962 in this century, I believe that's always been true. In 62, there were a few seats, but not a great many. So I think any help we get will really matter. The second thing I think that needs to be said about all of this is that it's not fundamentally an election driven by people organizing turnout operations. They may be very important in races that are 1 or 2 points. Fundamentally, I think, and I'll give the other side of what I said that was negative about what's happened to the communications process, people are much more independent and autonomous actors in terms of the votes they're casting than they were certainly 30 years ago, and even I would suspect 15 or 20 years ago.
Because of television and talk radio?
They believe, yes, they believe they know a lot more. And they do, and they believe that they can make the decision for themselves. And I think an awful lot of people decide to go to the polls or not to go to the polls on the basis of what they feel and their own reading of the issues, and calling them up doesn't matter a great deal. Now, in 1 or 2 point races, I think it could be very important.
If anyone has any questions, you're free to ask, stand up and ask. Meanwhile, while you're deciding if you do or not,
I wanted to pursue a point with Al for a moment.
why don't you pursue a point with Al for a minute?
Okay. Because the incumbency issue is one that I've seen around here. People are going to march into the voting booth on November 8th, and they're going to they're going to vote for a term limit measure. No doubt in my mind about that. And then they're probably going to pull a lever for a guy who's been in the Senate for 32 years. No doubt in my mind about that. I don't think there's any incumbent congressman who's going to go down in Massachusetts. I don't think there's any statewide official who's going to go down to defeat any incumbent in Massachusetts. And quite frankly, I don't get it. I mean, I don't understand what is at play here, and I'd love to hear either of you or Frank, if you can.
Well, what we keep getting, in the surveys that we do is something that hasn't really changed a whole lot in the last 4 years. People are a little bit more disaffected with Congress as an institution than they were 4 years. They were negative on Congress 4 years ago. They're even more negative today. When you ask them about their own members, we get almost the same number that we got 4 years ago. A little bit different mix, slightly down, but not much. And you're right. I agree with your characterization. And of course, what I love about the Republican contract is that it calls for term limits. 12 years. 12 years. Newt Gingrich has been there for 16 years, leading the charge for term limits.
Is that hate the
and
sin that love the
Bob Dole,
sinner?
do you know how long Robert Dole has been in the United States Congress? Anybody? 34 years. 12 years longer than Lyndon Johnson was when he was elected to national office, but he is a standard bearer for the party whose contract calls for term limits of 12 years. Now, eventually, Frank can put together every focus group he wants to, and they'll all say we're for term limits. No doubt they're for it. But it's a fraud, because they don't believe it. Newt Gingrich has told people once we elect enough Republicans, they'll forget about that issue.
Frank?
And I think that, just one final thing, as I said earlier, I think Clinton's overpromising caught up with him. This one will catch up, even more, because it can, and that's the mild stuff. The economic stuff is the real fraud.
Frank, if as you say, and Al says, the nation is disgusted with Washington, disgusted with Congress, why isn't your man Lamar Alexander the leading Republican contender at the moment?
Because roughly 15% of Americans have heard of him. How many of you all have heard of Lamar Alexander? Well, he's been up here.
You're at Harvard. Wait a second.
He says 6 months at home, move Washington out of Washington.
Which has significant support. By the way, and I will let Charlie Royer know the results, one of the questions we're going to ask on our post-election survey right after the election is, would you rather be governed by the Harvard faculty? We're going to use the Bill Buckley question. The Harvard faculty or the first 200 people in the Boston phone book. So when you guys come back after the election, I'll give you that information.
We have some questions here. Avery?
Hi, my name's Avery Gardner. I'm a sophomore at the college and a member of the Institute's Student Advisory Committee. And I'd like to put you all on the hot spot for just a couple of minutes and ask you to call specifically, with names, some of the elections that we have facing us. I refer specifically to Ollie North in Virginia, to the
Wait a minute, let's stop. We'll do one at a time.
Oh, okay, good.
We'll just go left to right here. North.
The convicted felon.
Okay.
Unfortunately, a convicted felon.
Yeah, I think Rob will pull it out.
Rob.
Okay.
Well, Michael?
He's also, I happen to believe he will win, but he
I'm
is
the
a client
moderator.
of our firms as well. We're working on
Well,
his
now
campaign.
we know why he's going to
But no, but I believe he will win.
That Rob will
I
win?
believe Rob will win, yes.
How about California with Huffington and Feinstein?
Huffington Feinstein.
Do I always have to go first?
This time you do.
I'll go first. I file win.
Feinstein.
Yeah, Feinstein.
Yes.
In our home state, Massachusetts?
Kennedy.
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 Okay, and what will happen to George Bush's sons?
They'll both,
Ooh.
they will both win.
You know, I don't know. Maybe one of them will win. I don't know. I don't know. I don't have any better, you know, I get to sit up here and you're standing out there. I don't know any more about either of those two races than you do.
Al
to be
says
honest
two
with you.
governors Bush.
Yeah, now wait a minute, Bob. If we're going to apply that standard, we got to get out of here quickly. I mean, it hadn't stopped us for the last.
Yeah, but you're paid.
It hadn't stopped us for 50 minutes. Why are we going to change the rules in the middle of the game? I think both Bushes will win.
Frank?
Yeah, they will be George Bush's revenge for 1992.
Shelley?
We'll get elected.
I think we'll get one in Texas, but not in Florida.
Okay.
Bob?
I said I don't know.
How about Tom Foley?
We are also working for the speaker. I do believe he will win.
Let the record show.
There's
Let the record show for those of you who,
I think he
who,
had-
who aren't watching this on television or something that he said that looking down at the floor to.
Let me tell you, I believe that is a very tough race. I believe Tom Foley is one of the most honorable people I've ever met in my life. I think that the candidate running against him has helped him tremendously. He's been named by the local newspaper not necessarily Nethercut, because every time he's asked a question by a reporter or at an editorial board, even as they say about an issue he himself has advanced, he begins his answer by saying, you know, they say, do you agree with X or Y, Z? He says, not necessarily.
Frank,
So,
Frank, are there any candidates you're representing you'd like to put in a word for here?
I think Newt can speak for himself.
Who's going to win? Foley?
We did a focus group up there, and the people in Washington would vote against him if they thought that everybody else was throwing out their incumbents. So that's why over the last 8 weeks or so, Foley's numbers came down. I think in the end he will be defeated.
He will be defeated. Al?
It'll sadden me a great deal, but I think the speaker will probably lose.
Shelley?
I'd have to take a pass. I really haven't a clue on that one.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Avery. Matt?
Hi, my name is Matt Anessis. I'm a senior at the college, and I'm chair of the Student Advisory Committee here. I have one more, and then I have my question. Cuomo.
I think Cuomo will win with a major assist from Mr. Giuliani.
Shelley?
Yeah, I think Cuomo will do it.
4 days ago, I would have confidently predicted Pataki. I think Giuliani really changed the whole dynamics of that race. I would hate to bet. If I were forced against the wall, I'd bet on Cuomo.
Giuliani was supposed to be the Republican that brought me back into the fold. He may be a Democrat in the next year. I think that one caused me a whole lot of hell. I think Pataki will still win by a very narrow margin.
And to follow up on the Ollie North question from before, if God forbid he does win,
How do you feel about the race, Matt?
will that mean anything for the '96 election? I mean, will that turn? Is that something that the Democrats will use to their favor, or will that turn people even more against Washington?
No, let me jump in on that right away. No, I can't use that, but it will profoundly affect it because I am convinced if Ollie North wins after he gets his basement office in the Russell Senate building, because he only works in basement offices, I'm convinced that Ollie will start running in '96. He's got a huge mailing list. He's going to look at that field and say, what a bunch of stiffs. He's going to say, you know, I've got intensity factor, the religious right's not really behind anyone. He's got a bunch of, you know, kind of people who probably unnerve Frank to no end around him. And I think there is a better than even chance if Ollie wins that he'll run in '96, and that will really foul everything up.
Oliver North, he's going to be to Bob Shrum's clients what Ted Kennedy was to our clients. He will be the fundraising god of the left, and they will use him, and they will raise millions of dollars from him. The problem that faces Republicans in Virginia, and again I point out to the people up here at this school that if you go down to some of the schools in Virginia, when someone would say Oliver North, people would cheer. They would stand up and cheer. The intensity of support for him in areas in Virginia is absolutely incredible, and he's got the most amazing fundraising list nationwide. So at least understand that there are others who think he's okay. Problem's going to be the guy's uncontrollable. And for Republicans, the question is, do you vote for him to get the 7th seat you need in the Senate? And it's been very difficult. Republicans won't say this in public, but they talk about it all the time in private. A lot don't really want to vote for him, but they feel like they have no choice because they so desperately want to get the Senate. And in the end, they probably will vote for him and put up with all the stuff they're going to get afterward.
I'll tell you a quick story. Can I just tell a quick story?
You can tell a long story if you want.
I did a column on Ollie 3 or 4 weeks ago in which I decided to list all of the prominent conservatives who've called Ollie a liar. And I made a decision that I wanted to call them, though, ahead of time and not just take a quote of 3 weeks earlier or 3 months earlier and just get it confirmed by them. And I called Caspar Weinberger. I called George Schultz and his assistant. He never quite said it that way. His assistant called back 10 minutes later and said, the secretary would like to be on that list. I called Cap Weinberger. And he said, who's a man I like. And he said, you know, he's awful, he's terrible, but I just, you know, I'm a Republican, I just don't want to get involved in it. We talked, and after he told me what he thought about it, I said, well, you know, if you think that. He said, no. I said, fine. The next day, column's going to run 2 days later. The next day, I'm in my office. About 2 o'clock, I get a phone call from Cap Weinberger. He said, I couldn't sleep last night. He said, please put me on that list. I mean, that really tells you something about what people who know Oliver North think of his character. When you talk to someone like Jim Webb was the Naval Academy classmate of Oliver North, a decorated hero in Vietnam, and the Secretary of the Navy under Ronald Reagan. And he starts to almost shake with rage at the mere mention of Oliver North's name. These aren't a bunch of lefties.
Can I have one? I think that I actually give people, the reason I think it's not just because he's a client of our firm and my partner David Doak is spending a lot of time on his campaign that I think that Rob will win. I think as a general proposition that Republicans will do somewhat less well than Frank and Al think, because I think voters are beginning to figure out some of the things that Frank shares with us as though it were an inside secret, you know, that Oliver North is an unguided missile and kind of goofy and you can't tell what he'll do when he gets to the basement. I think the voters are beginning to figure that out. And I do think there's a race against time here because I think there's deep dissatisfaction, which I think goes way beyond Generation X, by the way. I think it goes to people 50, 55, 60 years old who also believe they have an economic future or a bleaker economic future because of the things that are happening really in their lives. I think there's that frustration versus people actually focusing on these races and looking at candidates one by one instead of just sending a message. I could be wrong about that, but I think I see some of that happening in various places around the country.
Frank, how big a factor in the North race is Rush Limbaugh, and how big a factor is he in general for your clients and colleagues?
Limbaugh's going to be a very large factor, a very significant factor, because he's going to drive up turnout. He's going to make sure that those people who are angry and frustrated, many of them who voted for Ross Perot in 1992, understand that the way you express your opposition to the system, the way you express your anger is by voting rather than by staying home. And I will say that one of the things that we found, and I don't know if, Bob, if you've got this in your polling, is that Perot Democrats, of all the different Perot groups, Perot Democrats are the least interested because they don't want to vote Republican. They've voted Democrat all their lives, but they can't bring themselves to vote again for the system. And they're the ones that are most likely to stay home. If Republicans can capture that 7% of the electorate, then it truly is a landslide. If the Democrats can take them back, then they blunt much of the Republican
Or some of them back.
gains.
I'm really talking about taking some of them back, or some of them voting.
But Limbaugh beats at them and shakes them up and rattles their cage constantly. And by his presence, and these people listen to him in droves, he could be responsible for even a 1% increase in turnout, and that's a half a dozen congressional seats. Yes.
My name's Rudy Barnes. I'm a first-year student in the Kennedy School, and I've got a concern I'd specifically like Frank Lutz, I think, to address. And
Dr. Lunch, you can call me by my title.
Okay, Doc.
And anyone else could chime in too. I'm pretty curious. I worked on Capitol Hill for a few years, and
For who?
A member from South Carolina named John Spratt, moderate Democrat. A little over a year ago, I read something that really troubled me, and it was a Republican consultant, someone who would typically wear your shoes or do your type of thing, saying that come tax-paying day in April, they were going to hammer home the message that folks were paying more in taxes and should take their anger out on Democrats. And he was showed some statistics that indicated that 98% or some quite large number of folks actually weren't going to see their income tax rates go up. He said that's not really the issue. Perception is their taxes are going up. You tonight said something very similar very flippantly sort of dismissing the notion that Congress might actually be less corrupt than it used to be. For you, that doesn't seem to be important.
No, it's very important to me, which is one of the reasons why I'm involved in the process.
Okay, well,
Which
you've
is
begun
why
to
I would
answer the
also
question.
bring up Bob Packwood as an example, even though he's a Republican, as someone that should have gone.
Sure. If I could, you're already starting to answer it, but I guess my question is essentially, does it seem to you, you'll probably say no, but does it seem to you that the Republican Party, at least in the past couple of years, has found itself defending things not so much on the merits as good, but as good because they are perceived to be good, or simply because they're popular, they must be good? Hunt touched on this when he talked about giving his kids exactly what they wanted. You might put your answer in terms of the GOP contract, which previously I didn't hear you actually defend on the merits. You said we'll win so long as we
Okay, let me
do
answer
it.
you. The problem is that there's such a disconnect between the American people and their elected officials. The line that I've tried to use, and academics don't accept it, is that we live in a representative democracy. And so we expect our leaders to lead, and we're supposed to follow them. But they're supposed to have the guts to take positions that are sometimes not popular. The problem is that the public doesn't perceive that the elected officials are listening to them, that they care about them. There's this disconnect between when we vote and when they act, and when they promise during the campaign and when they deliver, or in most cases fail to deliver, when they actually govern. And the reason, and I'm a populist, more even so than being a Republican or a conservative, and I believe that we should actually, for a year or 2 years, and I'm waiting for the academics here to beat up on me, do what the public wants. I believe if 65 or 70%...
Even if it's contradictory.
Well, the things in the
For
contract...
example, lower taxes and a lower deficit.
That's not necessarily contradictory, and you have plenty of economists that would explain, and I'm not an economist, but you have plenty of economists that would not use the static model theory that the CBO uses, that would use an active model which says that when you do reduce certain taxes, you can actually gain more in revenues. But we're not here for an economic argument. What I would say is...
Deja
term
vu
limits-
all over again, Frank.
And if it's so bad, Mr. Hunt and Mr. Schrum, Republicans are going to kick ass.
Well,
in the
but his
fall.
question, and I have the
And the
contract
answer-
here, your question's a very good question. Frank says these things are popular. Here's the contract. Here's provision 8, the Job Creation and Wage Enhancement Act. You know what's in it? Capital gains tax cut. In other words, rename the proposal that's not very popular, call it Job Creation, Wage Enhancement, go to a focus group and say, people, do you like this? They say, oh yeah, we think that's great. And I will bet Frank a lot of money that there's not a single Republican in this country running an ad right now saying he'll go to Congress and fight for a capital gains tax cut, which will benefit the rich differentially. Not one Republican will do that. It will become the Job Creation and Wage Enhancement Act.
And the capital gains, that's an example of a tax cut that Republicans believe on principle. And some
Well, why
argue
don't they
would
say that as
Bob,
provision
let me
number 8, a
finish. Come on.
capital gains
Bob,
tax
Bob,
cut?
Bob,
But more to the point, how many of them have already walked away from it? I've interviewed 2 of them this week in Massachusetts, and we like it in concept. We love the contract isn't it's just kind of a concept. We don't subscribe to the gag rule, but we signed on because we want all of this debated. That's reason number 2. We want to open the process. We want to open the debate process. We'd like to see all this stuff come to the floor for an open discussion.
I just want to see that the wishes of the people out there get heeded. And that means term limits, which I'm not a supporter of. I'd like to see term limits. I don't necessarily believe that cutting staffs by 1/3 in the House of Representatives...
You're
will
not for the
necessarily-
contract you helped write.
Let me finish.
I mean,
If
right?
that's what the...
You just said you weren't for it.
Because it's not my job. Do you want me to put my own personal point of view out?
Well, yes, I do
Or do you
actually
want me-
think there is a certain obligation to connect your politics with your personal commitments, but I
am a pollster. You all applaud. I am a pollster. My job is not to put my own personal point of view on the line. Those of you who are professional understand that. My job is to reflect what the public opinion is all about. If you know about politics, you know about Stan Greenberg. One of the greatest problems with the Clinton administration is that his consultants have ignored what the public opinion is about, and they've allowed their own ideological bent, and your own newspaper's written about it, affect their advice to the president. If I do that, if I allow my own personal point of view to get involved in the advice, then I'm not doing my
Frank,
job. And no matter how
are you
much you
saying-
applaud, I'm never going to do it that
Frank,
way.
Are you saying that on every major issue, my congressman in Iowa should vote the way the Iowa poll tells them the feeling of the people in Iowa are at that moment?
I think that it's very important in the next year or 2 years for the representatives in Washington to do as much as they can to represent the wishes of their constituents, because until they get back the credibility.
Then should we elect them? Why not just
You don't
have
believe in
polls?
representative democracy.
Why not just have polls?
No, Americans don't believe in representative democracy
Well,
right now. That's the problem. Why do you think Congress is so hated?
Frank, Americans don't believe in the First Amendment sometimes, but I don't think we ought to do away with it. And if you did that, I'll tell you what the result would be. I mean, I know what there's
gotta
some things
go
about.
out.
Let me tell you something.
Al, you gotta get out of Washington.
You
You gotta get out of the
Well, let me
Northeast
tell you something.
corridor.
Fine. You believe we ought to close off all immigration, cut off immigrants? That's what people think. That's what they want. You think we ought to return to protectionism? That's what people want.
That's not
You
the
put,
case.
oh, they do. You put something on a ballot. Should we increase corporate taxes by 25%? Any state in America, that'll carry 70 to 30, and you know it. Should we do it?
Because you don't word it that you're guaranteeing the answer by the way you word the question.
Wait a
Right,
minute. I'm
which
just saying
is
the
why
question. Should we increase corporate
reinstating the
taxes?
gag rule is called the
Thanks a lot.
reinstating the gag
think,
rule is called the Family Reinforcement Act.
I think we know everybody's view on polls and the contract at the moment. And there was a lot of wagers made up here back and forth, which makes me want to ask Shelley, since gambling is about ready to come to Massachusetts, to explain how, by most
They
people's...
can earn their tuitions this way, you know,
That's
right?
right. And they were going to put a riverboat right out here on the lake.
Right on the Charles.
Explain to me how, in the other debate, the Roosevelt-Weld debate the other night, Roosevelt, by all reasonable interpretation the next day, won hands down. And yet there's not much of a movement, there doesn't seem, in any, it didn't get him anything.
Well, in point of fact, I think that Bill Weld won this election about a year ago. And that's when Boston Mayor Ray Flynn took a look at the race and said, nah, I'm out of here. Vatican looks a whole bunch better. Joe Kennedy took a look at the race and said, nah, I don't think so. The first team isn't in this contest. The first team never was. Bill Weld is getting a free ride.
First team for the Democrats.
Oh, correct, yeah. Bill Weld's getting a free ride. Mark Roosevelt is a nice guy. He's a bright guy, little whiny, doesn't come across terribly well.
Speaks highly of you.
Oh, well, I think he's perfectly charming. And actually, he's not bad for the Democratic Party in this state. Because he's taken a look at the numbers, and don't forget, we talk about a majority Democratic Party in Massachusetts. Not true. It's down to 40%. We've got 46% independents, or unenrolled, we used to call them independents. You look at those numbers, and Mark Roosevelt is looking at those numbers and saying, hey, I got to move my party somewhere. He's moving his party in all the right directions, but it's not good enough, and he is indeed the B team. And he can't capture the public imagination. Bill Weld's doing a hell of a job. And he hasn't raised taxes, which is what people basically care about.
When Mark Roosevelt loses, what's his future?
What's his future? The private sector, I think, would be nice.
Hi, my name is Chris Edelson. I'm a second-year student at the law school, and I'd like to pick up a little bit on the question that was asked before with reference to the Contract for America, and sort of linked to that, I'd like to ask what the Republican Party stands for. And I remember back in the late 70s and the early 80s when Reagan was running, there's sort of a certain similar kind of theme. Because a lot of people were voting against Carter, and Reagan seemed to be saying some of the same kind of things, trying to tell people what they wanted to hear. So I'd like to hear, is the Contract for America in fact different from what Ronald Reagan was saying in the 1980s?
I think that question's for you, Frank.
Just what I wanted to answer. What you're going to see in the fall, I guess you can't be off the record, but what you're going to see after the elections are over, and I'll give you one example, is that the Budget Committee is going to go out on the road, which is something that the Budget Committee in Congress has never done before. And they're going to give Americans the chance in various cities to literally attempt to balance the budget over a one-day seminar. To sit people to actually come and maybe invite them up to Harvard, spend a couple hours trying to give you some of the data, and then sitting down with whoever of you want to give it a shot, going over the numbers, and just seeing the process, the give and take. But a proposal is going to be made in December or January to take welfare, aid to dependent children, housing, health care, transportation, and other social programs, and completely eliminate them from the federal budget, and turn to the states and localities and say, what you want to do, it's up to you.
God, I wish you'd outlined this before the election so we could do a state-by-state impact statement.
Let me finish. What they're then going to do is take the tax rates for what most of you pay and cut them by somewhere between 1/3 and maybe as much as 40%. And what that is in effect doing is putting government back in the hands of the localities and putting government back in the hands of the states. Who delivers welfare better, a bureaucrat in Washington or someone who's out in Topeka, Kansas, or someone who's
Frank, they
out...
already do. The bureaucracy is here. All the federal government does is write a check.
But the,
Or mandate the service without the check.
which is, yeah.
Let me ask a question, Frank. I think that's interesting. I think it's a good debate. Why don't you hold it? Why do you hide it from the people now? Why is it a secret? Why is it going to be after the election? Why don't you tell people beforehand what you're going to do? I mean, I think it's a really good debate. Why don't you have it?
Can I?
Wait.
Why is it insane?
Well, no, but seriously,
Why
answer
is
my
it
question.
insane?
Well, Al asked the first
Frank,
question.
why
We'll get
don't
to
you have the
insanity
debate
next.
before November 8th? This is what elections are supposed to be about, I thought.
What am I here for tonight?
No, but why don't, well, but is Newt Gingrich talking about that? Is Bob Dole talking about that? Is Dick Armey talking about that?
These are proposals that are being considered. Army's talking about a flat tax. He's put the proposal out, but not many people write about it.
The flat tax is a different proposition. Let me tell you what I think this is all about, and I'll be cynical for a moment. I think this is all about the fact that Bill Clinton is president, and that they know that Bill Clinton is not going to let people get into a situation where all transportation, Frank named virtually the entire federal budget, discretionary domestic budget, is done
no
away with.
military.
So,
He's gonna-
so what
no
they
military.
want to do is do the old waste and fraud shell game in 1996 and say, look, we could have gotten your tax rates down by X and Y and Z, but Bill Clinton stopped us. He wouldn't let us cut these things. This is not a program for governing. It's a program for deadlock for the next 2 years, which is, I think, exactly what they're planning. You know, I understand what our role as political consultants is, or political pollsters, and Frank and I have a different role, but I also think that there's a certain responsibility on the part of the office holders at a certain moment to say we don't want to go past a certain point to try to win an election. In 1990, there were people who told Gephardt and Foley and Mitchell that if they caused what was then known as the train wreck, that is, they didn't fulfill the budget and the whole process broke down, that there could be political advantage in that for the Democrats. And basically, those people got thrown out of the room. Now, I think at a certain point, if people don't really like this contract, they have an obligation to do more than say to Shelley, well, actually, in spirit, and I shouldn't have signed it, and that part I don't mean. The governing people at least have a responsibility to be somewhat straightforward with people on what they're about and not about.
Al,
it
what
is
will be the
pretty clear.
impact?
Wait,
What will be
wait,
the-
Can I respond? I do want to say that the Republican philosophy, whether you agree with it or not, is to get government as close to the people as possible. Is not bullshit, it's true.
But when you specify
And
what
the
that
thing is-
means,
and-
Republican
wait,
candidates
wait,
always
wait.
get in
Let me-
trouble.
And the thing is that, again, I mean, I get frustrated, and this is not a great appearance here, but all I know is that you are so not typical of the rest of the country. There's a reason why Republicans are not coming up to the Kennedy School in December for their presentation, for the orientation, and what's going on here is exactly that reason. It's because the rest of America doesn't think the way you do. I know I'm being offensive in saying it so strongly, but at least you're going to learn something from all of this. You may hate my guts for it, but the people in Washington State don't feel this way, and a whole lot of challengers are going to be a whole lot of incumbents. The people in Iowa and South Dakota and Texas and Oklahoma and Tennessee don't think the way Harvard students and the people up in Boston think. And they want government, back home. They don't want it in Washington. Now, you may think that it's horrible and evil, and Bob Schrum is a lot quicker than I am, which is why he's won all these debate championships. I can't respond as quickly as he does with cute lines, but I'm telling you that the government either will be returned back to the people, Mr. Hunt, or the people will continue to grow more cynical, more angry, and they will completely tune out of the entire system. They won't vote, they won't care, and they'll teach their kids not to be involved with politics again. And that's not what this place is about either, Mr. Schrum.
Question.
Michael?
Question.
My name is Michelle Sullivan, and I've been here 3 weeks, and I'm from Wyoming. And
It hasn't set in yet then, right?
and my issue actually has specifically to do with this and about a few open seats that are on the platter. The issue in Wyoming has been Clinton. And it's interesting for me to hear you tonight because it seems to me that the issue that you're bringing up is actually not Clinton, it's actually Washington. And so I'm interested in thinking about the Wyoming election specifically because I think it is an important one. It's actually important to me, I should admit, because my father's running for Senate. But my question is, how much will Clinton have to do with it, and how much will it be the fear of or mistrust of Washington, where you have two incumbents going against one another?
See, if I'm just a strategist, then I talk about Clinton. I thought that we were going to be a little bit less partisan here so we could talk about what's on the minds of the people. So if I'm a Republican, I'm going to show that picture of Clinton and the Democrat, and they call it morphing, I think it is, where the picture slides into Bill Clinton and then slides back to the candidate, and everyone in their mind say, that Democrat's just like Clinton, I'm going to vote against him. But that's not at the deep root of it, because Congress is more unpopular than Bill Clinton is, and Washington is even more unpopular than Congress is. And I know what your first, I didn't catch your last name, so I don't know what you want to result from this.
No, that's fine.
But one of the problems that's going on also in Wyoming and Colorado and Montana and Idaho are land rights. The idea of the federal government tying up land for environmental purposes. You find a lot of ranchers and a lot of people out there very uncomfortable with Bruce Babbitt making decisions that they don't have a say over. And again, it gets back to who makes the decisions, a bureaucrat in Washington or someone in your own local community. And that's what Republicans are trying to do.
You're saying that that's what you're finding in the polls.
Yes.
You're saying that as the pollster now, not as the Gingrich advisor or anything.
I say that as a pollster.
Oh, okay. I just want to understand the context of the answer.
What's your last name?
Sullivan.
Hope you win.
Democrat.
I wish you well.
Michael?
Yes.
See, I think that part of what Frank says is true. And by the way, I don't think we should make political cases here, and we can talk at an analytic level. I did think the question that was asked by the person who worked for Congressman Spratt was an interesting question, because at a deeper level it was, what obligation do those of us who play a functioning role in the process have? And that, to some extent, is what I was trying to address. But one of the things I find interesting in the polls, I think if you asked in Massachusetts, for example, do you think you'd like a smaller government that spent less and a smaller deficit, everybody would say yes. And I think if you asked, would you like the federal government to stop funding the Central Artery and the Third Harbor Tunnel, everybody would say, oh, heavens, no. We'd like them to get rid of the waste and the fraud. I think and look, at a political level, I think what the Republicans are doing, as I said at the outset, is very smart. It is basically a politics of grievance and generality, which is you find out what makes people mad, you find generalities that tell people you're going to do something about it, and then you go out and campaign on that. And then your real plan after the election, I think, is to build toward another politics like that in 1996. But I think, Frank, you'd agree in a lot of these states, if you said, do you want to abolish specific programs, if you got this down to any level of specificity, people would say, oh, no.
Yeah, it gets down to the sort of one man's pork is another man's bacon. People say, oh, pork, it's awful and we can't have it, and let's cut it out of this bill and let's cut it out of that bill. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to this federal program and making an impact on people's water bills, it's coming from the federal government. They have an entirely different attitude.
We just have time for one more question.
You may not want it to be mine then.
We do indeed.
I'm Catherine McNeil, and I'm at the Kennedy School. More importantly, I'm from Houston, Texas. And so for those of you that commented on the Bushes sweeping Texas and Florida, would you make a comment to whether or not you thought either one of their parents had coattails, and why you would think Ann Richards, as the most popular governor in Texas with her numbers very high right now, is going to lose?
Al?
No, I don't think either of the parents have coattails. They're going to, I don't think they're going to win because they're George Bush's kids. They're going to win because they are running as Republicans in two conservative states, which in a good year for Republicans. I think, I guess I disagree with someone who earlier said, I guess it was you, Shelley, who said that you thought that George W. would win and that Jeb would lose. If one of them wins and one of them loses, it might be the other way around, because Ann Richards is terribly popular there. But I just think it's a very difficult climate to run for governor of Texas as a Democrat in 1994. But I don't think if both the Bush boys I don't think it'll have anything to do with their father.
Frank?
I also don't think it has anything to do with the parents. Ann Richards is the exact opposite of Virginia. I think that in Virginia, if North wins, he will win with the lowest favorable rating of any U.S. senator in American history, or at least since the advent of polling in the 1930s. And Richards may be one of the more popular governors. Certainly she will probably be the most popular governor who loses. But in Texas, the anti-Clinton feeling is so strong and so pervasive. And we're finding it with a significant percentage of those who consider themselves Democrats. Because Texas, in a lot of places in Texas, is very conservative. They're still not Republican, but they're conservative Democrat. And it's the conservative Democrats that are bolting from her and supporting Bush because they're mad at Clinton that I think will put George W. over.
I noticed, just as one final closing question here, nobody at this panel here tonight, nobody in the debate last night mentioned anything to do with anything outside the borders of the United States. Why?
I've yet to meet a single voter in a focus group that will be voting for a congressional candidate based on foreign policy.
Al?
No, I agree with that, and I'll tell you in many ways, the most important election of this year. I mean, if you get rid of the people you care about personally, and that is Proposition 187 in California, the anti-illegal immigration measure, which may be the most nativist, racist proposition to ever go on a ballot in America.
The only way this election is now related to foreign policy is the fact that Clinton's in the Middle East. I think it'll bring his numbers up immeasurably, and that could have a ripple effect on some congressional races where he may be a factor, or even a governor's race where he may be a factor. But apart from that, yeah, people have tuned out.
I think that foreign policy isn't a big issue in this election. I think in part that's because it usually isn't. I think we always say, why isn't foreign policy a big issue? And it almost never is. And I think the other reason is that Clinton is getting, not only not getting the credit for what he's done, he's getting a lot of blame for things that actually, in fact, have gone quite well. I mean, we did the Haiti thing, no American soldier got killed, all of the terrible predictions about what's going to happen haven't happened. We've got troops parading down the street with people waving tree branches and palm fronds behind them, and he's just not getting much out of it. And I think that's because Frank is fundamentally right, and the rest of us are right. People are focused in on the domestic stuff.
Since we're in a situation where you think Frank is fundamentally right, I think that's a fine note to end this on.